Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Today's installment, recorded on September 28, 2022, features Alistair Mackenzie on Thomas Telford's influence on civil engineering in British North America.
Welcome, everyone. I'm your host for today's Transatlantic Cable Civil Engineering History webinar. My name's Gordon Masterton, and I'm chair of the Institution of Civil Engineers Panel for Historical Engineering Works. And our remit is engineering foresight from hindsight. So here's the agenda for the next hour, finally. This collaboration is between three learned societies, and we're using, of course, engineering technology to connect ourselves and to share current thinking around civil engineering history. And recognizing that civil engineering history crosses international boundaries, and we explore the connections between the UK and North America, which are many and varied. That's the purpose of this collaboration between the American Society of Civil Engineers, Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Institution of Civil Engineers, largely in the UK. Our speaker this evening, an old friend of mine, and I come to think of it, most of my friends are old nowadays, but my old friend, Alistair Mackenzie, Professor Emeritus at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Alistair was president of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering at the same time as I was president of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Alistair, that's 17 years ago. And I have happy memories of that year and inviting Alistair and many others to the UK to celebrate Brunel's bicentenary. Our focus tonight is on Thomas Telford, the Institution of Civil Engineers' first president, and his influence on North America. Alistair, it's my great pleasure to be handing over to you for your presentation.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gordon. Thomas Telford is a legend of civil engineering who needs no introduction from me, nor any elaboration on his place in the history of the profession. Telford's reputation was such that by the early 1800s, his opinions on civil engineering projects were being sought internationally in countries such as Sweden, Poland, India, and Panama. And British North America was no exception to this need for knowledge. And although the great man never visited North America, his influence on early projects there was very significant. Now, we're talking about British North America at this time. That's Britain's colonies in North America, as shown in that map to the left of Telford's portrait. The bits marked in brown, Canada West, Canada East. They had various titles, Upper Canada and Lower Canada at one time or another, but that's sufficient to nail the whole thing together. The Dominion of Canada did not come into existence until 1867, so most of the works that we're discussing were from before that date. It seems to me that there are three particular areas of influence that we can look at to determine Telford's importance in North America. Firstly is direct work. This is consulted work in which Telford himself was directly involved in providing reports and other advice. And then I've said Telford Associates, works carried out by engineers who had worked with and learned from Telford before coming to British North America. And thirdly, indirect work, the application of Telford technology, really from printed works rather than direct involvement of either the engineers or Telford himself. So the direct work that he was involved with, I've got four particular examples, the earliest being 1825, although I believe Telford had been consulted before that to give advice on recommending engineers for some particular projects. I think the Lachine Canal was one of them there. Anyway, I've got 4 examples there: Bayvert Canal, Welland Canal, Shubenacadie Canal, and some work for the General Mining Association, Sydney Harbour, Nova Scotia. I put up this map, which covers generally the same area as was shown in the British North America colonies map. And I put this map up particularly so that you can identify where I'm talking about. So the first one I've got is over here, the Bayvert Canal in Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, in Nova Scotia, they're suffering very much at the moment from the last weekend from the remnants of Hurricane Fiona. Bayvert Canal, how did Telford get involved in that? There's a letter there from the Sir Howard Douglas, the Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, to Telford, saying, we're really looking for your skill, advice, and information because we're planning to undertake some significant works in the not too distant future. And he particularly points out the isthmus between the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Bay of Fundy, about 37 miles across, and it's our intention to put a canal of some sort across there. Telford's reply came later saying, thank you for all this, and you've asked me to recommend a properly qualified person. In fact, there was a properly qualified person already in North America, Francis Hall, who had worked with Telford in the UK. That's Telford's report from one of the government publications. And on the right, I've indicated the rough area where the canal was to go through. And the whole idea of that canal was essentially to shorten the ship routes between St. Lawrence ports and the Bay of Fundy or New England ports there. I'm going to blow up a couple of bits of Telford's report just to make some points. The very first part I would like to draw your attention to, where he mentions Francis Hall. He says, for several years previous to his leaving Britain, he had employed Hall very extensively. So he's got perfect confidence in Hall's ability and that he will do a good job in terms of carrying out the work should it go ahead. He's got some advice in the next little bits here, saying what he thinks should be done with it in relation to Hall's initial report. And he winds up by doing an estimate of the cost of the canal and adds a little addendum there saying, but you could vary this a little bit if you did this or that in terms of modifying what it is that's been already set before you. Now, that was the extent of Telford's involvement in this one, because in fact, the canal was never built, despite Hall's report, Telford's report, and one or two others. This went on for many years, discussions on it, and it was eventually derailed by a government change. One government seemed to be in favor of it and promptly lost a general election. The following government was not all that happy about it, and they derailed it and sidelined the whole thing for a projected ship railway. Now, the ship railway is another story altogether, which I'm not going to get into. It was partly built, never finished, again, derailed by finance and politics. That's the CSCE historic site plaque, which we've erected on the site of that railway. Engineer Henry Ketchum, and just to illustrate transatlantic interest, he got support and assistance from the likes of Benjamin Baker, James Brunlees, and Edwin Clark. Anyway, we have no canal and we had no ship railway in the end. So that was the end of Telford's involvement in that corner. So we move next to the other side of my map here, to the Welland Canal. Now, I'll just blow up that corner a little bit there. So we're talking of that isthmus of land throughout there, and the intention is to get a vessel passage between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie to facilitate transportation of materials, finished goods, down through the Great Lakes to Erie, Ontario, and then through the St. Lawrence River down to the Atlantic ports of Montreal and Quebec City. And there was at that time competition because, in fact, there was an American canal, the Erie Canal, which ran from the head of Lake Erie along through New York State to Albany, thence down the Hudson River to New York. For those of you who are not familiar with this area, I said Welland Canal. We've actually had 4 Welland Canals. The final one that is in use today is shown in the thick blue line. including a little bit where it seems to divert at the bottom. The mark 1973 bypass is the correct line through there. But we and Telford were interested in the initial stages. The first Welland Canal, that's the entrance to Erie Canal, just to give you the context of where the Welland Canal sits in relation to it. The first Welland Canal was projected by William Hamilton Merritt, a local businessman and a mill owner. I mentioned mill owner because half part of the idea of the canal was to assist in providing water power for mills, which were down towards Lake Ontario there. So the initial idea of that canal, phase one, was to follow the red line that I've got there, which as you see comes up. It uses one of the water courses coming off Lake Ontario. Then it has to climb over 190 feet. The Niagara Escarpment runs through there. That's the same as escarpment across which the Niagara Falls drop. It required 35 locks to take it up over the escarpment there. And the intention was to run that then to the Welland River. And then vessels would travel in the Welland River down to the Niagara River and then south into Lake Erie. There were some problems with the ground conditions in the canal, and the bit marked deep cut just at that right angle created all sorts of problems. Eventually, the level of the canal had to be raised, which meant that they had to put in a couple of additional locks to drop vessels back down to the Welland River. But more seriously, the idea was that the Welland River originally had been intended to provide the water for the summit level of the canal. And now the canal was above the level of the Welland River. So what had to be done was to get a very long feeder canal, about 40 kilometers to the nearest source of water from that point on, which was in the Grand River, which solved that particular problem. But it was also decided at that point to carry on with what would have been the second phase of the canal and run it right down to Lake Erie. Telford's report, that's again extracted from one of the government documents there. It's a report signed by both Thomas Telford and Alexander Nimmo. And I'm going to just highlight the last section of it there, that bit in red, where the Telford and Nimmo say, from the plans and sections that have been submitted to us, it all sounds very good indeed. I don't know what the plans and sections that were submitted to them were. There's very little records available of the first canal. There's loads of records of the second and third canals, and unfortunately very little, as I say, of the first canal. Telford makes the point that I mentioned about mill power there as well, and also the prolongation, as I said, the phase two into Lake Erie, which would save all sorts of complications because of the head of the Niagara River, and therefore would have a material advantage, he says, or they say, over the New York Canal. There's very little left, as I say, of the first canal. Top right-hand corner, excavation of Lock 24 of the first Welland Canal in 1987, which was then backfilled to preserve it. The photograph on the left-hand side is an aerial shot dated 1930, which shows the remnants of the first canal to the left, the second canal to the right. And I noted above, they more or less followed the same route. And the first canal's locks were wood, as you see from that photograph there. The second was masonry, so we lost all of the wood very, very quickly indeed. They diverted slightly from their same routes, and that photograph shows them at the top of the escarpment there, a slight diversion. That's virtually disappeared today. The third canal in the background took a totally different route. And Telford was very enthusiastic about the canal. He bought 20 shares for £225 sterling. Nimmo did half of that, £112, 10 shillings sterling. Both quite significant amounts of money for that day and age. So we move on. That was the extent of their work on the Welland Canal. We move back to Nova Scotia to the Shubenacadie Canal. And again, blowing that one up a little bit, it's about 71 miles long. It runs from the port of Halifax to the Bay of Fundy, a place called Maitland at the top end there. This one was again back to Francis Hall, who worked on it initially. Telford was consulted. Once again, he was very positive, and once again, he bought shares in the company. Construction started in 1826, but all sorts of redesign. So Hall was asked to do a redesign in 1829. I mentioned Telford shares. There's a stock certificate with his name on it there. You can't see it very clearly, but it is there. And on the right is the list of subscribers. And I'll blow that one up there. And there you can read Thomas Telford, 24 Abington Street, Westminster. And the amount he subscribed at that time was £450 sterling, even more significant. I mentioned the redesign in 1829, and in that year, Charles Fairbanks, company director and one of the principal promoters of the canal, travelled to London to look for investors and also to visit Telford, taking Hall's revised plans with them. Telford got a positive endorsement. And I like this bit below here, which is Hall showing a letter that he'd received from Fairbanks. And, you know, it's my dear sir, soon after my arrival, I called him Mr. Telford, but he was absent. I repeated my visit and was gratified to meet a very pleasant old gentleman who appeared to feel much interest in your welfare and spoke of you in very friendly terms. So we confirmed that this all sounds good, all very good. The engineer's great, the work he's doing is great. This should work beautifully. There's a couple of Hall's drawings for the canal. On the right-hand side, it's dated 1826, so that was one of the original ones. The mapping section on the left, 1829, so that was the revised version. All sounded good, but the canal company went bankrupt in 1831. Construction was resumed in 1834, supervised by Charles W. Fairbanks. That's not the Charles Fairbanks that I mentioned 2 or 3 seconds ago. This is his son, who got very interested in the canal, mainly because of his father's interest, and decided to go to study civil engineering in the UK. So he went to the offices of Sir John McNeill, another close association of Telford. So again, we get the Telford connection all the time here. On our commemorative plaque, you know, as Fairbairn's mentioned, Francis Hall is mentioned, and the third engineer mentioned is Angus McDougall, who was local and, in fact, who wound up being chief engineer in the canal when the others went on to do other work. That's the story of the Shubenacadie Canal. We now move on back to Nova Scotia, to Cape Breton, and some work that Telford did for the Sydney Harbour, for the General Mining Association. What I'm going to do is show you a couple of odd quotations here. This is from a paper by the late Herb MacDonald, who was a historian, particular rail enthusiast, coal mining enthusiast in Nova Scotia. I mentioned at the start in 1834, the board had hired 2 high-profile British consultants, Telford and John Buddle. I've got John Buddle on the right, who was known as a colliery viewer. He was an expert on mining, coal mining, and the transportation and distribution of coal. He was located in the northeast of England and was internationally known, so it was no great surprise that he was consulted on this work here. What MacDonald notes that both would be armchair consultants. He says, neither crossed the Atlantic to view the site in person. Telford's role was limited to a review of plans for the location and construction of a breakwater, and Buddle on the underground stuff. Now, White Crimes has done a lot of work on Telford's work around about 1833, and I've extracted some stuff from his paper on here, and the top bit is extracted from Telford's diary. He mentions he spent 7 full days on the Sydney Harbour work, further mentions of 10 other days there. Duval was the General Mining Association contact he had there. Other correspondents, Buddle, of course, Abernethy, Thomas, and Turnbull. Turnbull, I think, at that time was probably Telford's closest assistant, and I believe he may have even produced some drawings for the project. Mike's note there says Telford's design relied on information sent by Buddle regarding the northeastern coal staiths. That's the loading platforms there. So I think in the look of that, I think to describe his involvement as merely an armchair role, maybe substantially understating what the role is. There's a note from Duval to Buddle, instancing Telford and talking about the difficulties of the breakwater at this point here. I wondered if I could get some photographs of these coal piers. Bottom left-hand corner, Nova Scotia Archives, Shipping Piers General Mining Association, 1899. But looking at that one there, if you look at the diagram on the right, the diagram on the right talks of a new GMA wharf built in 1876. So that's considerably after Telford and Buddle, so that cannot be anything to do with what their work. The undated postcard from Nova Scotia Museum at the top left-hand corner clearly, I think, shows that the construction in the foreground is that new pier. The stuff in the back may well be something that relates to somewhere near the date of Telford and Buddle. I'm not entirely sure of that. The situation today is very different. The coal wharfs have gone altogether. The Newfoundland ferry and indeed the odd cruise ship leaves from the same point that the wharfs were at. And it may well be that that breakwater on the right may be the great-great-great-grandchild of what Telford had done. But again, I'm not sure of that indeed. That wraps up the 4 direct involvements of Telford in British North America. So I'd move on now to the engineering associates, as we call them there. And off a number of them, the 2 most prominent in my mind certainly were Francis Hall, who we already heard mentioned several times, N.H. Baird, that's Nicol Hugh Baird. That's the front page of what calls itself an alphabetical record of engineers and superintendents employed in public works. Now you'll note it says Canada. It says Canada because if you note the date there at the end is 1891. So by that time you are in fact in the Dominion of Canada at that stage there. But this lists all of the engineers. Telford's actually listed as well, but he only gets 2 lines mentioning the Shubenacadie Canal and the Bay Verte Canal, because these were government projects, whereas the other ones involved in private ones. Anyway, Hall's, this is Hall's listing on that database, if you like. And it includes at the start some details of what he did in the UK with Mr. Telford. I'm not sure about the extent of the whole thing. He presumably provided the information himself. So I've no idea how accurate the whole full description is. But it then moves on to all of the other things that he did, most of which we've mentioned before already. So I'm not going to go into any much further detail with Francis Hall, because I think we've covered him reasonably well. But there's a couple of things to be looked at here. 2 other canals where he did some work on, both at different ends of my map. The Burlington Bay Canal on the left, which is shown in the photograph there, just down the road from where I live, so I'm very familiar with it. St. Peter's Canal over in Cape Breton. He just did a report on this one, as far as I know. Yeah, I don't think he was involved in it beyond that point. The Burlington Bay Canal was one of Hall's drawings for the canal, initial work of the canal. He did it, didn't stick around all that long in it. 2 or 3 other people had shot it afterwards, and it was considerably changed and improved to the extent that it is today. Some more of Hall's work there. Good Telford stuff, roads on the left and a harbour on the right. So all good Telford stuff here. The knowledge and experience over to British North America. That's a couple of sheets of roadworks estimate by Francis Hall. Very neat, very orderly, looks very good indeed. Quite impressive the way that he carried that out. You come across all sorts of odd things when you're doing some research like this. There's a bit in the Welland Canal. Hall was involved in the Welland Canal as well, which I hadn't mentioned before, but it was after Telford's time. So this is one signed apparently by Francis Hall and W.H. Merritt. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the last entry there, which is June 24th. And it says, to engineer for horse keep. I guess horses were the main transportation in those days. So the engineer, I guess, didn't get a company car. He presumably got a company horse. But anyway, there we are. That pretty well wraps up what I want to say about Hall. Hall obviously brought a great deal of Telford-related information and technology with them. The other one is Nicol Hugh Baird, and that's his entry from that same database. And you'll notice it doesn't say anything at all, in this case, of what he had done before he came to British North America. But he had, to greater or lesser extent, worked on the Forth and Clyde Canal in Scotland and the Union Canal in Scotland, where his father, Hugh Baird, was the engineer. Oh, Francis Hall incidentally worked on them as well. These guys were falling over each other all over the place. Baird's initial work in North America was on the Rideau Canal. On the left is a letter signed by Lieutenant Colonel John By, and he's writing to his commander-in-chief, and what he's writing about is replacing the indomitable John MacTaggart, who had been at the canal with him for some time. You see MacTaggart's name at the top left-hand corner there shows up. He's getting a replacement for him. Baird has been suggested to him, apparently, but his note says, I haven't yet had the chance to interview him, but from the bit I've blown up, from the handsome manner in which Mr. Telford speaks of this gentleman, I have no doubt that he will answer my purpose. So he did hire him. Baird did work, picking up Taggart's work on the Rideau Canal, general location in red, detail of it there, one of the C.W. Jeffreys sketches from Library and Archives Canada, imagining Colonel By watching the building of the Rideau Canal. So Baird worked there for some years, but from our point of view, I think at CSCE, we think that it's even more significant, the work that he did on the Trent-Severn waterway. Trent-Severn, not to be confused with you guys in England with Trent and Severn over there. This is the one that we have here. It runs from Lake Ontario to Georgian Bay on Lake Huron. And we commemorate Baird's work on this. And you'll notice that on the plaque, we say engineered during the early years of survey and construction, because he was not around when the iconic Peterborough and Kirkfield lift locks were put into place. Just a little indication of one of his drawings on the left for timber slide at Crookes Rapids, and the picture at the top shows Crookes Rapids today. It just gives an idea of the location of that Trent-Severn waterway. He's working on again. This is some of his notes about the projected Soulanges Canal. You'll note in this one that over to the right, he immediately goes straight to Telford. About Telford and the locks. He's talking about the Caledonian Canal there. And it's really what he's saying, in effect, is that this is how Telford would have done it. So this is the way we're going to do it. So direct pulling of Telford's information and technology into the work that he was looking at. We pick up all sorts of odd things again, looking around. There's Quebec Mercury, it's a Montreal newspaper, June 20th, 1840. Little paragraph there, Mr. N.H. Baird, civil engineer, has been in town some days and is engaged in making plans and specifications for lots, etc., required to finish the Chambly Canal. I can't finish with Baird without commenting on the fact that he left what I consider a very big legacy here, a volume of documents that he left with his own work, now housed in the archives of Ontario in Toronto. I myself, some years ago, spent quite a few days going through these things. A letter from Colonel John By is one of the ones that I picked up there. And interestingly enough, the documents also include some of his father's work, including work on the Union Canal in Scotland. That runs through these two engineers bringing their knowledge of having worked with Telford over to North America. So the third one is the indirect work, as I've said here, the incorporation of Telford methodology, really from his published works, other references. I've just got two examples. They're both roads, and I've said there maybe it's appropriate because Telford was known as the Colossus of roads. What publications am I talking about? Telford's Atlas, of course, is well known, 1838 published and was generally available there. The other interesting one is the Edinburgh Encyclopedia, which appeared over a number of years and included, it's an absolutely marvelous document. I've fortunately been able to see a fair bit of it, or a fair bit of one of the editions there. I've highlighted there 2 pages on bridges. But the little note at the bottom here, and I'll blow it up, it's a bit bloody, but you can just about see it. This is the editor being indebted to Thomas Telford And Alexander Nimmo again, smart guy was. Anyway, the examples that I've got are these here, Upper Canada, not far away from the Toronto area, where the note is, in this contract, the tender was for macadamization in the usual way, but we're not going to do that now. It's now proposed to work upon the plan of Mr. Telford, by whom it is recommended as greatly preferable to the plan of Mr. Macadam. The old Telford Macadam controversy as to who produced the better roads, the better design of roads is still there. The other example from Nova Scotia says more or less the same thing here. We think that the plan adopted by the Parliamentary Commissioners of Highland Roads and Bridges is deserving of imitation in Nova Scotia. The system is fully explained in Mr. Telford's Life, edited by John Richmond. Okay, the spelling didn't cross the Atlantic, it's John Richmond, of course, there, but there we go. Two different areas of British North America, both recommending that we use Telford's work, they said, instead of the Macadam stuff. So, folks, on the basis of what I've said there, even the colonies of British North America, although we've got no Telford projects to view, and although the master himself never set foot in British North America, his influence was clearly felt, and Telford methodologies provided a firm foundation for subsequent civil engineering work as the new country, which was to become Canada, developed from that point. A couple of acknowledgements, special thanks to Mike Grimes for all the stuff that he dug out for me, and to Roland Paxton for first encouraging me to research this. I'm quite happy to take any questions, but bear in mind, one, I'm not a historian, two, I'm not a Telford scholar as such, and if I don't know, I will tell you very, very quickly that I don't know. So thank you all.
Alistair, that was absolutely terrific. Many thanks indeed. And if we were able to share with 76 now, I saw 78 at the peak participants, then I'm sure we'd have a hearty round of applause for your talk there. And I'm also very pleased that there are questions. I suppose now that everyone can see me, I need to explain this a little bit. I'm in black tie, not just in honour of the esteem of the speaker tonight, Alistair. I'm in 1 Great George Street, the headquarters of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and immediately after this webinar, there's a president's reception. So the current president, Ed McCann, is having a dinner this evening. So, Alistair, you've said that you're very happy to take questions, and I can see already they're building up, and please do, everyone else on the call, please do use the Q&A button and please add to the list. And the first is not a question. This is from Sue Thredder, who's bridge clerk to the Bridges Trust of the Rochester Bridges Trust, and an engineer, and looks after the maintenance of that bridge. And first one is the observation that it's not a question, but an observation that Hall's estimates look very similar to those produced by Telford. And in parenthesis, maybe all estimates look the same. But have you come across is there a Telford style of estimates, Alistair, that you can use as part of the justification for the influence that he brings to others?
I don't think I can, Gordon. In fact, you may know more about that than I do in terms of stuff. I've got no comparison to make really with Telford's estimates. The only ones that I've seen have come out of government documents, so there's not a style with them. They're just really printed.
Indeed, I can't add to that really, but I think in his school there probably is, as you've described, a Telford school. His apprentices and these engineers that supervise the works inevitably will have had a degree of commonality about the way they presented their reports and their estimates. I suspect there are any estimates I have seen quite a lot of as well. And they're similar but different. Now, the question from Sue, however, is there much information about Telford's direct works in the UK-based archives, or is it mainly now held in Canadian archives?
Oh, I think most of the information is in the UK archives. As I said, I've relied on Mike Crimes digging out all sorts of stuff from the ICE archives there. So the information is there. As I mentioned earlier, the only extensive archives that we've got of work in British North America by the engineers is Nickel Beards, which is very extensive indeed, but not Telford stuff. No, I think that resides pretty well in the UK.
And that ties in nicely with Sandra. Sandra Purvis has a question on the particularly related to the Union Canal information held in Canada. Do they have any plans? As they're in Scotland, from Sandra's research work, there are not many surviving in Scotland. So can you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, there's quite a bit that traces the line of the canal. And in fact, I was particularly interested in the area around Falkirk, where you run into the Falkirk Wheel now and that. And my wife comes from Falkirk, so I was particularly interested in having a look at where it ran there. So there's 2 or 3 interesting different variations of where he planned the canal to go at that point throughout there. It's some years since I looked at it, so I really can't fill you in with much more detail than that. But the short answer is yes, there's a fair bit of information there.
Well, that's a tempting prospect, Sandra, for adding to your archives and records and knowledge on the Union Canal, to fix up a trip to Canada or invite Alistair over. Question from Robert Morris. In your researches, Alistair, did you discover any other celebrated UK engineers having involvements in Canada?
Well, of course, Rennie, to some extent, was involved in recommending engineers throughout there. And in fact, I mentioned the likes of the guys who participated a little bit in that Chignecto Railway. But no, I haven't got any other really, really solid information about a lot of the engineers that way. They may be, there's some that is more recent in date than the dates that I was looking at there. Going back to the time that I was looking at, no, I don't have a great deal more information there.
Thanks, Alistair. There are a couple of compliments rather than questions from John and Dave Gilbert, but worth noting. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, John. Question from Jim Kells. I'm curious as to Telford never having come to Canada, or as you referred to it, British North America, in order to in some way oversee engineering works of considerable significance. Is this simply a matter of coming across the ocean, being too long a journey, maybe 7 weeks, in one direction, though therefore too much of a time challenge for engineers like Telford?
It may well be. I don't normally answer Jim Kell's questions just to get things. I suspect it was just that. And by the time you get to the 1833 time there, Telford was getting old and he was not fit to travel very much there. So I suspect it's just the distance and the fact that he was really only peripherally involved in these projects anyway. As I noted there, several of them didn't go anywhere very far anyway. So I would assume it's just distance and later on the state of his age. Thanks for the question, Jim.
And I suppose, Alistair, at that time still, the only communication, the written communication, the only one that was available. And so even a letter would take 7 weeks to reach the addressee. It's really hard for young engineers to even contemplate that in the world of digital connectivity. Now, here's a question from Alan. Great talk, first of all. Having grown up in the shadow of Telford's Menai Suspension Bridge in Anglesey, I'm curious about any examples of suspension bridges in Canada influenced by the great man.
I'm not sure that there were. I think I mentioned, or it came up in that sort of database information, that Hall, in fact, had designed a bridge to span the Niagara Gorge. It never got very far at all, but he certainly was picking up Telford's information and trying to do something with it that way. I'm really not aware of any other ones. Again, most of them come a lot later than the time we're talking about.
I've got one here, Mike Bartlett. Here's a thought for you. It's Mike's strong sense that we should we make the Welland Canal a CSCE National Historic Site, or maybe even a joint ASCE CSCE International Civil Engineering Historic Landmark, the ultimate accolade.
I really think we should, but then you maybe extend it beyond that and make the whole of the St. Lawrence Seaway a joint international historic civil engineering site. I would like to see the Welland Canal recognised. There are one or two of our old engineering EIC, Engineering Institute of Canada, plaques on the Welland Canal, and I think we've probably shied away from it a little bit because there's already some recognition there. But yes, I would certainly like to see it. And as I say, maybe we extend it to the whole of the St. Lawrence Seaway.
That's a project to think about, Mike, and for colleagues like Dave from the ASCE.
Dave can join in for sure.
Absolutely. Dave Gilbert's put a supplementary question in. Do we know if Telford influenced any engineering work south of the border in the US, what used to be British North America as well, of course, Dave?
It was indeed. Yes, of course he did. He most certainly did. You know, Sammy, I'm going to sort of step aside a little bit on this one, because Henry Petrosky has written a fair bit about the influence of Telford on American engineers, and he mentions, if I recall correctly, James Buchanan Eads, Donny Roebling, and Othmar Aman, amongst others. And if you want some information on it, his book is Engineers of Dreams. He's got quite a lot in that there. There's one or two other publications he writes regularly at American Scientist. And if I recall correctly, he had one installment directly on Telford. So the answer is most certainly yes, but I'm not going to run into that one there. As I say, I'll refer you to Dr. Petrosky.
Very good, Alistair. One question from me, Alistair, just think that I've been inspired by the scale of the ideas that were being generated in the early 19th century, especially given the state of technology at the time. I mean, these were grand projets by any definition. Are there still? Do you get the sense that engineers in North America, British or not, and even the UK, from your continuing connections, are we as ambitious and as exciting for improvement projects as engineers were in the time, even at the time of the early 19th century? And I think it even grew, I would say, into the 19th century, culminating in massive engineering achievements like the Forth Bridge, for example. Are we as exciting and ambitious with our engineering today as we were then?
I really think that we are. Of course, we're past the day of the great chief engineer who was the big household name in charge of these things. We're very much more, and quite rightly, I think, team-based. But yes, I think we've got plenty of ideas. I think there's a lot of work being done that is just as imaginative as the works carried out in the early times that we're talking about.
Very good. And Roland has put in a congratulations, Alistair, on a great lecture. Roland, I'm really glad that you've been tuning in.
Roland, good. Yeah, excellent.
Nothing you could have said has clearly raised any concerns from Roland. So that's the stamp of approval, the ultimate stamp of approval.
That's the ultimate stamp, indeed. Yes. Thank you, Roland. Indeed, as I say, he was my mentor and got me going on this subject in the first place.
Absolutely. Well, that was sound advice, and really glad that you've followed it, Alistair. I've maybe got one other one related to, the quality of and the degree of the specification work. The Macadam and Telford different systems for road making. And can you expand a little bit about that and explain to those on the call what the broad principles of the differences were? Macadamization had nothing to do with tar in those days. But Alistair.
No, I think the basic difference was the road base, where Telford had a lot heavier of a road base than Macadam did. Macadam's roads were, I think, easier and cheaper to build, but not as substantial as Telford's roads. And I suppose the selection of which type to go for very much depended on the amount of traffic on the road, the weight of the traffic and the frequency of the traffic there. But the basic difference, I think, was in the heaviness of Telford's structure as against the lighter version of Macadam's. That's very briefly, Gordon.
Indeed, indeed, and enthusiasts can read about that further if they wish. But there was quite a debate at the time between the two, and when you get Scotsmen into an argument, then that's a recipe for a very long argument. Mike has put up a question in relation to, as we heard, Telford took shares in more than one of the North American projects there. How common was it for engineers in those days to buy shares in projects that they were involved in? And Mike observing, I think, of course, financiers probably took the lion's share of shares, but was it common for engineers, or was Telford unusual?
I'm not at all sure. I feel he was a bit unusual, but again, sidestepping this, one person who knows a great deal about this is Mike Crimes, who did quite a substantial analysis of the salaries and the amount of money that engineers brought in. So I'm not an expert on that one. I would defer to Mike. I would think that Mike's information would be much more pertinent than anything I have to throw in.
And Mike just had sent his apologies. I think he said he would be on a train at the moment, unfortunately. But that's, again, something to follow up on. Congratulations from Bernie Dennis and ESC.
Bernie, good.
History and Heritage Committee. Thanks very much, Bernie. Well, I think we have run out of questions. We've exhausted Alistair already. But what I would like to do, apart from a hearty thank you, Alistair, for all of the preparation that you've put into the half-hour presentation there, and you've served the purpose extremely well, because having ample time for Q&A allows these additional questions and interactions, and I think that's a great model for Zoom or Teams, as opposed to a 50-minute lecture and 5 minutes for questions. So we've really, I think, done the event format justice this evening. And I'd like us all, again, to virtually send a hearty thank you, even in the Q&A, and there's probably some in there being added as I speak. And yes, there are. Kathy, thank you very much. The hearty thank you to Alistair for a wonderful talk, and perhaps inspired a few others to follow threads and look into influences, transatlantic influences in more detail. It'd be nice to have some in the other direction as well. North American engineers that have made their bigger impact in the UK and Europe. That would be a nice thing, a nice challenge to throw out. And lots of points, lots of thank yous going into the questions. Thanks, Alistair. What I would like to conclude with, come back again. We're planning a regular series of these connecting across the Atlantic with the new Atlantic cable. Join us then. Thank you, everybody, for listening and participating.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here.